Welcome from very sunny and beautiful Aruba. No, I'm kidding. It's a pandemic. I don't leave Massachusetts right now. But there is a lot to talk about. Last week, I did a story called We Owe the World an Apology and an Explanation. And that story was really focused on having to sort of make good with the world for the fact that more than 60 million Americans voted for Donald Trump in 2016. And in so doing, unleashed absolutely unconscionable destruction upon the world. That was last week. And the focus was mostly the micro while touching on some of the big areas where the United States has been really a drag on the world under Donald Trump. So we talked about climate change, of course. We talked about, naturally, how could I not mention our disastrous response to coronavirus? But there's an entire sort of other story to tell about the United States under Trump, which is less about Trump per se and more about the way in which our status quo has been exposed as dangerously fragile in so many ways, which is something that even people who are not necessarily Trumpists have been sometimes hesitant to really consider as seriously as we should. And of course, the virus itself has exposed a lot of fragility. A lot of jobs that seemed rock solid were not really rock solid. Entire industries, quite frankly, were not as solid as we thought. Our supply chains, we figured out very quickly, are very fragile. The medical system, of course, that's useful to think about. But there's a way more sort of pernicious fragility that has been exposed, including, for example, our alliances with other countries around the world. This is not coronavirus specifically now. This is what I'd call a sort of Trump fragility. Allies that we felt were rock solid, our primary important allies, were very quickly, as soon as the United States was challenged and was no longer a reliable, predictable partner, and instead we became this sort of erratic, counterproductive fiasco. Many of our allies abandoned us. Now, they didn't do it in a way where they would now be considered adversaries, certainly not, but to different degrees and in their own ways, we saw what we thought were very solid alliances be exposed as extremely fragile. Very quickly, Germany, France, and Canada, for example, realized we can't deal with Trump like an adult. We're actually better off without the American president in the room at all when we're having certain conversations. That's embarrassing and that's bad for us long term. Now, I don't necessarily want to go directly into a sort of geopolitics game theory type of analysis, but it is kind of hard to avoid when you look at what's going on around the world, because when you look at the superpowers of the world, US, Russia, and China, and you think about the last 4 years, it's not looking particularly good for the United States. This may not be your top priority, but if you concede that the most likely superpower in the world is likely to be either the US, China, or Russia for some time, a United States that's increasingly isolated and losing allies is bad. It's bad for Americans. As China gains leverage in the increasingly failed trade war that Donald Trump has been waging against them, as Russia continues to benefit from the destabilization and the lack of credibility of American democracy, partially at their own doing, of course, we suffer. There's a very good article in Rolling Stone from this weekend by Wade Davis called The Unraveling of America. And it focuses on this debasement of America in the context of coronavirus. The article is great. But almost every argument that Wade Davis makes, and he makes the arguments well with respect to coronavirus, we could actually apply in the United States more broadly. I'll give you an example. Davis says in this article, which you should read in its entirety, the American handling of coronavirus has called into question the idea of American exceptionalism. I would go further. Our failed response to coronavirus has confirmed that the idea of American exceptionalism was but a shiny Band-Aid covering up serious injuries. It exposed many of the cultural failings that coronavirus has made clear, the lack of our ability to really come together as a country to do what just needs to be done, even if it's difficult, for the betterment of humanity. The financial fragility has been exposed. Wade Davis's article reminds us that almost every empire has fallen. The ends of empires are rarely anticipated, and they often take a while, but you don't notice that the failing empire is failing until you look back later. It's the United States this time that needs the world's help, as just about every other country has better dealt with coronavirus than we have. So what is it that hurt us? Yeah, of course, Trump's response was a disaster, but there's more. There's really cultural problems. Is it too much individualism in the United States? Is it a lack of education or of good enough education? Delusions of grandeur? All of the above. Yeah, probably some component of all of those. So I encourage you to check out the piece in Rolling Stone. And if we step back for a moment from the sort of day-to-day of the Trump administration, what has become clear is that beyond Donald Trump himself, this type of way of running the country is not going to allow us to solve the big problems that we're facing. So in no particular order, step back from coronavirus a little bit. If you think about climate change, if you think about getting everybody health care, if you think about ending optional poverty and hunger, which are optional right now, I mean, it's just we've just not decided to fix them, but hunger and homelessness are optional at this point in time. Creating government that is not cronyistic and corrupt, big things. None of those problems are going to even be seriously explored from the standpoint of solutions under an administration like the one we have. It's not just the day-to-day pedestrian xenophobia. That's an afterthought. But it's the pseudo-intellectualism, the anti-intellectualism, the hyper-nationalism, the intellectual isolationism. That's when you look at how every other country realizes this is a time to trust science and doctors. And we are isolated intellectually or anti-intellectually, where you have people saying Fauci and Bill Gates are the enemies here. That's not suited for the 21st century and beyond. And it's hurting us now, visibly with coronavirus, but it's more about the list of problems we won't be able to solve if this is how the United States operates more broadly. Now, I know many of you will say, well, okay, 63 million people voted for this administration, 65, 66 voted against it for Hillary Clinton. This is not about the electoral politics. This is about a realization of what is the path forward for humans with something that is very antiquated. And by the way, when I say antiquated, I'm more than willing to entertain the argument that in times past, this type of mentality made more sense. I'm sensitive to the idea that in early humanity, many of the traits that now are a problem were adaptive from an evolutionary standpoint, favoring these ideas of, hypermasculine alpha male, physical violence, individualism for yourself or your small group, isolationism. There was a time in human history where that made sense, and that is a totally reasonable thing to think about. But it doesn't make sense now, and the people sticking to those ideas are quite literally stuck in the past. When we say conservatism, what we're talking about is trying to conserve a way of life from the past merely because it's what we used to do, even if it doesn't make any sense now or in the future. And that's exactly where we are today. A lot to think about when you bring it back to, well, we're less than 3 months from an important election. And today I'm going to be outlining some of the big differences between the options that we have in November, differences that maybe are not the ones that are getting the most attention.